The rain hammered against the windows of Margaret Chen's suburban Chicago home like angry fists demanding entry. She stood in her kitchen, still wearing her black funeral dress from 3 months ago, watching her son Michael pace back and forth across her hardwood floors. His expensive suit, the one his wife insisted he wear to look professional, was wrinkled from the long drive from their gated community in Naperville. "Mom, we need to talk," Michael had said when he arrived, his voice carrying that cold, distant tone she'd grown to dread over the past year. At 34, her son had become someone she barely recognized. His father's gentle eyes, now hard with an ambition that seemed to consume every ounce of warmth he'd once possessed. Margaret's hands trembled as she poured herself a cup of coffee. The ceramic mug her late husband David had given her for their 25th anniversary. The kitchen, once filled with the laughter of family dinners and Michael's childhood friends, now felt cavernous and empty. The silence between them stretched, like a chasm that had been widening ever since David's sudden heart attack. "I've been thinking," Michael began, his voice cutting through the sound of rain. "And Jessica and I have made a decision." Jessica, his wife of 5 years, a woman who smiled with her mouth but never her eyes, who had systematically worked to distance Michael from everyone who had loved him before she came along. Margaret set down her mug with a soft clink. "What kind of decision?" Michael stopped pacing and turned to face her, his expression as cold as the October wind rattling the windows. "We're moving to California. Jessica got a promotion with her consulting firm, and I'm going to start my own tech company out there." "That's wonderful, honey," Margaret said, though her heart was already sinking. She'd suspected this was coming ever since Jessica had started dropping hints about new opportunities and fresh starts during their increasingly rare family gatherings. "But there's more," Michael continued, his hands clasped behind his back like he was delivering a business presentation. "We've decided that we need to cut ties with certain people who might hold us back." She gripped the edge of the granite countertop, her knuckles turning white. "Hold you back, Mom, you have to understand," Michael said, his voice taking on that patronizing tone she'd heard him use with his employees. "Jessica and I are building something important. We're moving in circles where image matters, where connections are everything, and frankly," he paused, running a hand through his dark hair that was exactly like his father's had been, "your constant negativity since Dad died, your inability to move on, it's become a burden." Margaret felt the room spinning around her. "Negativity. Michael, I buried my husband of 30 years 3 months ago. A widow who works part-time at a community center?" The cruelty in his words stole her breath away. This was her son, the boy she'd rocked to sleep during thunderstorms, who'd once made her Mother's Day cards covered in glitter and crooked hearts, who'd cried in her arms when his high school girlfriend broke up with him. "Jessica thinks," Michael continued relentlessly, "and I agree, that for us to truly succeed, we need to surround ourselves with people who share our vision, people who understand success." "I don't understand what you're saying," Margaret whispered. Though she was beginning to understand all too well, Michael's face hardened further, and for a moment, she saw a flash of something that reminded her of his father, but it was David's stubbornness, twisted into something cruel. "What I'm saying, Mom, is that you're no longer part of our family. Jessica and I have decided that we won't be having any contact with you going forward." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Margaret stared at her son, searching his face for any sign of the boy she'd raised, the young man who'd once told her she was his hero. But all she saw was a stranger wearing her son's face. "I've never been more serious about anything in my life," Michael replied, checking his expensive watch, a gift from Jessica, not something he'd chosen himself. "We're flying out tomorrow morning. I came to get the last of my things from the garage and to tell you in person because, despite everything, I'm not completely heartless." Margaret's legs gave out and she sank into one of the kitchen chairs where she and David had shared thousands of morning coffees, where they'd helped Michael with his homework, where they'd planned their modest dreams together. "Your father loved you so much," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "He was so proud of you, so proud of the man you were becoming. If he could see you now, if Dad could see me now, he'd be proud that I'm not settling for mediocrity like he did." Michael snapped, his voice rising. "Do you know what Jessica's father said when he met Dad? He said Dad was charmingly simple. That's what 30 years of marriage to you got him the reputation of being simple." Margaret felt something break inside her chest, a pain deeper than even David's death had brought. "Get out," she whispered. "What?" "Get out of my house," she said, her voice growing stronger even as tears continued to fall. "Get your things from the garage and get out. If I'm not family anymore, then you have no right to be here." Michael's expression flickered for just a moment, a shadow of uncertainty, maybe even regret. But it was gone so quickly that Margaret almost thought she'd imagined it. "Fine," he said, straightening his tie. I'll send someone for anything else I might have left behind. Don't try to contact us, Mom. Jessica's already blocked your number, and I'll be doing the same." He turned and walked toward the door, his footsteps echoing in the empty house. At the threshold, he paused without turning around. "For what it's worth," he said quietly, "I hope you find a way to move on with your life. Just ... do it without us." The door closed with a soft click, leaving Margaret alone in the kitchen that suddenly felt like a mausoleum. She sat there for a long time. Lightning illuminated the family photos on the refrigerator, pictures of camping trips and birthday parties, Christmas mornings and graduation ceremonies. 34 years of memories that Michael had just declared worthless. But as Margaret sat in the gathering darkness of her kitchen, something began to stir inside her, not just grief, but something harder, something that had been sleeping since David's death. She thought about the safe hidden in the back of her bedroom closet, the one that even David had rarely seen opened. The safe that contained more than Michael could possibly imagine. Maybe it was time for her son to learn that there were some things more powerful than Jessica's ambition and his own cruel betrayal. Maybe it was time for him to discover that the simple life he'd just rejected had been built on foundations he'd never bothered to explore. Margaret wiped her tears and stood up, her spine straightening with a resolve she hadn't felt in months. If Michael wanted to cut ties with his family, that was his choice. But he was going to learn exactly what he was walking away from. Mand, the truth might be more than he could handle. 3 days had passed since Michael's devastating visit, and Margaret had barely left her bedroom. The house felt like a tomb, filled with the ghosts of happier times and the echo of words that couldn't be taken back. She'd called in sick to her job at the community center. The job Michael had called embarrassing, and spent most of her time staring at the ceiling, replaying 34 years of motherhood. Across the kitchen table, like fallen tears, Margaret had meant to throw them away, but somehow their decay felt appropriate, a fitting metaphor for how her family had crumbled. It was Thursday evening when she finally forced herself to eat something more substantial than the crackers and tea that had sustained her for days. As she moved through the kitchen, mechanically preparing a simple sandwich, her phone buzzed with a text message. For one wild moment, her heart leaped. Maybe Michael had changed his mind. Maybe he'd realized what he'd done. But the message was from her neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, an elderly woman who'd lived next door for 15 years. "Honey, I saw a young man taking pictures of your house today. Thought you should know. He was very well dressed, professional looking. Hope everything's okay." Margaret stared at the message, confusion mixing with unease. Taking pictures, she walked to her front window and peered through the curtains. The street looked normal, quiet suburban tranquility under the amber glow of streetlights. But something about Mrs. Patterson's message sent a chill down her spine. She was about to dismiss it as perhaps a real estate appraiser or insurance adjuster when her landline rang. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize, but something compelled her to answer. "Mrs. Chen?" The voice was crisp, professional, with just a hint of uncertainty. "Yes, this is Margaret Chen. My name is Robert Caldwell. I'm an attorney representing the Hartwell Group. We're a development company interested in purchasing properties in your neighborhood for a planned commercial development." Margaret's grip tightened on the phone. "I'm sorry, but I'm not interested in selling. I understand completely, Mrs. Chen, and I want to assure you that we're prepared to make a very generous offer, well above market value. Your son Michael actually reached out to us about your property." The words hit her like a slap. "My son? What do you mean, my son reached out to you?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. "I... Perhaps I've said something I shouldn't have. Mr. Chen indicated that you might be interested in relocating, given your recent loss. He seemed to think that a fresh start might be beneficial for you." Margaret's hands began to shake. Michael hadn't just cut her out of his life, he was actively trying to uproot her from the only home she'd ever known. The house where she and David had built their life together. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, her voice dangerously quiet, "I need to be very clear about something. I have no intention of selling my home. Not to you, not to anyone. And my son had no right to contact you about my property." "I see," Caldwell said, clearly uncomfortable. "There seems to have been some miscommunication. I apologize for the intrusion. Mrs. Chen, we'll remove your property from our list immediately." After hanging up, Margaret sat in her living room staring at the family photos that lined the mantelpiece. Michael at 5, grinning gap-toothed in his Little League uniform. Michael at 16, proudly holding his driver's license. Michael at 22, walking across the stage at his college graduation while she and David cheered from the audience. When had he become someone who would try to sell her home out from under her? When had the boy who'd once promised to take care of her when she got old turned into a man who would collaborate with developers to force her from her own house? The betrayal felt fresh and raw, like a wound that kept reopening just when she thought it might begin to heal. But beneath the hurt, something else was growing, a cold, hard anger that she hadn't felt since David's death. Margaret walked upstairs to her bedroom, her feet moving with purpose for the first time in days. She went to her walk-in closet and pushed aside the winter coats that hung there like silent sentinels. Behind them, built into the wall and hidden behind a false panel that David had installed years ago, was a safe that few people knew existed. She'd only opened it a handful of times since David's death, and never for more than a few minutes. It contained documents and mementos that were too painful to look at, too important to throw away. But now, with Michael's betrayal burning in her chest like acid, she knew it was time. Her fingers trembled as she entered the combination: David's birthday, then hers, then Michael's. The heavy door swung open with a soft click, revealing neat stacks of documents, a few pieces of jewelry, and several thick manila envelopes that hadn't been disturbed in years. The first thing she pulled out was a leather-bound photo album she'd forgotten was there. Opening it, she was greeted by pictures from a life that felt like it belonged to someone else entirely. There she was at 23, young and radiant in an expensive evening gown, standing next to a man in a tuxedo who wasn't David. The photo was taken at some charity gala in downtown Chicago, and she remembered that night with perfect clarity: the champagne, the orchestra, the feeling that the whole world was spread out before her like a glittering promise. The man in the photo was Jonathan Hartwell III, heir to one of Chicago's oldest and wealthiest families. They'd dated for 2 years, and everyone, including her own parents, had expected them to marry. Jonathan had been handsome, sophisticated, and utterly devoted to her. He'd also been the father of the baby she'd been carrying when she made the decision that changed everything. Margaret's throat tightened as she turned the pages, seeing herself in a world of country clubs and charity committees, private boxers, at the opera, and summers in the Hamptons. It was a life that Michael could never have imagined, his simple mother living, a life she'd walked away from for reasons that suddenly felt more relevant than ever. She set the album aside and reached for a thick envelope marked legal documents in David's careful handwriting. Inside were papers that told a story of sacrifice and love that went far deeper than Michael could possibly understand. The first document was a property deed, showing that the modest house Michael was so embarrassed by was actually part of a much larger estate. What appeared to be a simple suburban home was actually the original caretaker's cottage on what had once been a grand estate belonging to the Hartwell family. The main house had been torn down in the 1960s, but the property, nearly 15 acres of prime real estate, now worth millions, still belonged to Margaret. The second document was even more stunning: a trust fund established by Jonathan Hartwell III, with Margaret as the sole beneficiary. The trust, which had been quietly growing for over 30 years, was worth more than $8 million. David had insisted she never touch it, wanting to build their life together on his own terms, with his own hands, but the money had always been there, waiting. The third document made Margaret's hands shake so violently she almost dropped it. It was a birth certificate, Michael's birth certificate, listing Jonathan Hartwell III as the father. She sank onto her bedroom floor, surrounded by the debris of secrets she'd kept buried for 3 decades. The truth was more complicated than any simple document could convey, involving a love triangle that had torn her heart in two, and a decision that had cost her everything she'd once thought she wanted. But as Margaret sat there in the dim light of her bedroom, holding the proof of Michael's true heritage, she realized that her son's cruelty had awakened something in her that had been sleeping for far too long. He wanted to cut her out of his life. He wanted to dismiss her as irrelevant, embarrassing, holding him back. Well, perhaps it was time for Michael to learn that his simple mother was far from powerless. And perhaps it was time for him to discover that the family he was so eager to abandon had secrets that could change his life forever. If he was lucky enough to learn them before it was too late. Margaret carefully placed everything back in the safe except for one item: a sealed letter addressed to Michael in David's handwriting, with instructions that it should only be opened when our son needs to understand the truth about love, sacrifice, and what it really means to be a man. That time, Margaret realized, had finally come. Margaret hadn't slept in 2 days. The contents of the safe had shattered her world as completely as Michael's betrayal had, but in an entirely different way. She'd spent hours going through documents, reading letters, and reconstructing a past that felt simultaneously like her own life and like something that had happened to a stranger. The hardest part was reading David's journal entries, pages and pages of his thoughts about raising another man's son, about the sacrifices they'd both made, about the love that had grown between them despite the complicated circumstances of their beginning. David had written extensively about his fears that Michael would someday need to know the truth, and his hope that by the time that day came, their son would be mature enough to understand the complexity of love. "I pray," David had written in an entry dated just 6 months before his death, that if Michael ever learns about his biological father, he'll also understand that biology doesn't make a family. Love does. Commitment does. Being there for someone every single day, even when it's hard, even when it's thankless, that's what makes a father. Those words echoed in Margaret's mind as she sat in her kitchen on Friday morning staring at her phone. She'd been debating whether to call Michael for hours, knowing that once she opened this door, there would be no closing it again. But his attempt to have her house sold had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed before she could lose her nerve. She dialed his number. It went straight to voicemail. He'd clearly blocked her as promised. So she called his office instead, using the work number she'd memorized from years of being a proud mother who bragged about her son's career to anyone who would listen. Chen Technologies. This is Michael Chen's office. A young woman answered. This is Margaret Chen, Michael's mother? I need to speak with him immediately. It's urgent. There was a pause. I'm sorry, Mrs. Chen, but Mr. Chen left specific instructions that you weren't to be put through to him under any circumstances. The casual cruelty of it, that Michael had instructed his staff to block his own mother, hit Margaret like a physical blow. But it also strengthened her resolve. Then please give him a message, she said, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. Tell him that Margaret Chen called regarding the Hartwell Estate and Trust Fund. Tell him that if he doesn't call me back within the hour, I'll be contacting the Hartwell Group directly to discuss certain legal matters that affect his future. There was another pause, longer this time. I'll make sure he gets the message. Mrs. Chen. Margaret hung up and waited. She didn't have to wait long. Her phone rang 37 minutes later. Michael's voice was tight with anger when she answered. What the hell are you trying to pull, Mom? What's this about the Hartwell Group? Are you trying to sabotage the property deal? Hello, Michael, Margaret said calmly. I'm surprised you called. I thought I wasn't family anymore. Cut the dramatics. What do you want? Margaret closed her eyes, gathering her strength. I want you to come home today. There are things we need to discuss, things about your father, about our family, about who you really are. I told you. We're done, Michael said. Whatever game you're playing with the Hartwell Group, knock it off. Jessica's father is already asking questions about why my mother is connected to his competitors. Jessica's father, Margaret repeated, a puzzle, piece clicking into place. Michael, what's Jessica's maiden name? What does that have to do with anything? Answer me. Morrison. Jessica Morrison. Why? Margaret's heart sank. Morrison Holdings was one of the Hartwell Group's biggest rivals in the Chicago development market. Jessica hadn't just married Michael, she'd strategically positioned herself to gain access to information about her father's competitors. And if she'd found out about Margaret's connection to the Hartwell family? Michael, you need to come home right now. Your marriage, your career, everything you think you know about your life, it's all built on lies. You're insane, Michael said, but there was uncertainty in his voice now. I'm not playing your games, Mom. Stay away from my business. Stay away from my marriage and stay away from me. If you hang up this phone, Margaret said quietly, I'm calling Jonathan Hartwell III directly. I'm telling him that his son is married to a Morrison and has been feeding information to his competitors for years. How do you think that's going to affect your precious new life in California? The silence on the other end of the line stretched for so long that Margaret thought he might have hung up. When Michael finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. What did you just say? Come home, Michael, today. Come alone. And maybe, just maybe, you'll finally understand what family really means. She hung up before he could respond, her hands shaking so violently she could barely set the phone down. She'd just played a card she couldn't take back, revealed a secret that would change everything for everyone involved. But Michael's cruelty, combined with what she was beginning to understand about Jessica's true motives, had pushed her past the point of protecting anyone but herself. 4 hours later, Margaret heard the sound of tires on gravel. She looked out her window to see Michael's BMW pulling into the driveway alone. He sat in the car for several minutes before getting out, his usual confident stride replaced by something that looked almost like fear. When Margaret opened the door, she barely recognized the man standing on her porch. Michael looked like he'd aged years in the few days since their last encounter. His expensive suit was wrinkled, his usually perfect hair disheveled, and his eyes held a hollow look that reminded her painfully of David during his worst days at the plant. I'm here, he said simply. Now what's this about Jonathan Hartwell being my father? Margaret stepped aside to let him in, noticing how he avoided looking at the family photos that lined the hallway, photos that suddenly carried a weight neither of them had understood before. Sit down, Michael, she said, gesturing to the living room couch where she'd rocked him to sleep as a baby, where David had helped him with algebra homework, where they'd celebrated his acceptance to college. This is going to take a while. Michael perched on the edge of the couch like he was ready to bolt, his body language screaming defensiveness and disbelief. But Margaret could see something else in his eyes, a flicker of the curious boy he'd once been, the child who'd asked a million questions about everything from clouds to butterflies to why some families looked different from others. "Before I tell you anything," Margaret said, settling into David's favorite chair across from him, "I need you to understand something. Your father David was the best man I've ever known. Whatever you learn today, that doesn't change. He loved you more than life itself, and he was your father in every way that mattered. But not biologically," Michael said, his voice barely audible. "No, not biologically." Michael's face crumpled, years of certainty collapsing in an instant. "How long have you known I knew?" "I've always known, sweetheart. From the moment you were born, and Dad from the beginning. He chose to raise you anyway. He chose us." Margaret stood up and walked to the mantelpiece, picking up a photo of the three of them from Michael's 8th birthday party. David was helping him blow out the candles while she watched from the side, all of them laughing at some joke she couldn't remember anymore. "You want to know about family, Michael?" she said, turning back to face him. "This is family. Not the money, not the status, not the connections you think are so important. This moment, right? Here a man who chose to love a child who wasn't his blood because that child needed a father." Michael's carefully constructed walls were beginning to crumble, but Margaret could see him fighting it, clinging to the anger that had carried him through the last few days. "Why are you telling me this now?" he asked. "Why not years ago?" Margaret's smile was sad and gentle. "Because 3 days ago you told me I wasn't family anymore, and maybe it's time you understood what you were walking away from." She set the photo down and walked toward the stairs, pausing at the bottom. "Come with me, Michael. It's time you saw what's in the safe." The bedroom felt smaller with Michael in it, his presence filling the space with tension and unspoken questions. Margaret had retrieved everything from the safe and laid it out on her bed like evidence in a trial: photographs, documents, letters, and mementos from a life that existed before David, before the modest suburban existence that Michael had found. So embarrassing. Michael stood frozen in the doorway, staring at the birth certificate that bore his name, and Jonathan Hartwell III's signature. His face had gone pale, and Margaret could see his hands trembling as he struggled to process what he was seeing. "This is impossible," he whispered. "Jonathan Hartwell. The Jonathan Hartwell. His family owns half of downtown Chicago." "Owned," Margaret corrected gently. "Jonathan died in a car accident 12 years ago. But yes, that Jonathan Hartwell, your biological father." Michael sank into the chair beside her bed, his legs apparently unable to support him anymore. "I don't understand. If you were involved with someone like that, why did you end up with Dad? Why did you end up here?" Margaret picked up the leather-bound photo album and opened it to a picture of herself and Jonathan at their engagement party, event that had made the society pages of 3 newspapers. She looked so young in the photo, so confident in her future. She'd had no idea how quickly everything would change. "I was 23 when I met Jonathan," she began, her voice taking on the cadence of a story she'd never told but had lived with every day for 35 years. "I was working as a secretary at his father's company, and he was everything you'd expect from someone born into that world. Charming, sophisticated, completely sure of himself." She turned the page to show Michael more photos: charity galas, polo matches, dinner parties where she'd rubbed shoulders with mayors and senators and captains of industry. "We dated for 2 years. Everyone expected us to marry, including me. But Jonathan had a problem. Michael, he was brilliant in business, charming in social situations, but he was also weak. When his father disapproved of something, Jonathan folded. Every time, Michael was staring at the photos like they were artifacts from an alien civilization. What did his father disapprove of? Me, Margaret said simply. Jonathan Hartwell, too, didn't think a secretary was suitable for his son. He had someone else in mind, the daughter of another wealthy family who could bring political connections and social standing to their empire. She closed the photo album and picked up a letter written in Jonathan's distinctive handwriting. The paper's still creamy and expensive after all these years. When I found out I was pregnant with you, Jonathan promised me everything would be fine. He said he'd stand up to his father, that love would conquer all, that we'd face whatever came together. Margaret's laugh was bitter, but when his father threatened to disinherit him, to cut him off completely, Jonathan chose his trust fund over his child. The betrayal in her voice was still fresh, even after 3 decades. Michael was listening intently now. His business facade completely dropped as he struggled to understand the magnitude of what he was learning. So you married Dad instead. I married David because he was the only person who offered to love both of Usu and me without conditions, Margaret said, her voice softening as she thought of her late husband. David was a mechanic at the garage where I took my car. He'd seen me crying in the parking lot after one of my fights with Jonathan, and he offered me a cup of coffee and a kind word. She picked up David's journal, the pages worn from his fingers, turning them over years of reflection and soul-searching. David knew I was pregnant. He knew the baby wasn't his. And he proposed to me anyway, because he said every child deserved a father who would choose them every day, not because of blood or obligation or social expectation, but because of love. Michael's eyes were bright with unshed tears, but Margaret could see him fighting the emotion, still clinging to the hard shell that Jessica had helped him build around his heart. "That's a beautiful story, Mom," he said finally, his voice carefully controlled. "But it doesn't change what I said. David might have been a good man, but look at what his choices cost you. Look at where you ended up." Margaret stood up and walked to her dresser, picking up a document that made her hands shake every time she touched it. "Where I ended up," she repeated, turning back to face her son. "Michael, do you know what this house is worth? It's worth whatever someone's willing to pay for it, maybe $200,000 if you're lucky." Margaret handed him the property deed, watching his face. As he read it, she saw the exact moment when understanding dawned, his eyes widening, his mouth falling open, his hands gripping the paper like it might disappear. 15 acres, he breathed. "This is 15 acres, but I thought, the neighbors, the other houses, ... are built on land that was subdivided and sold off over the years," Margaret explained. "This house, the house you're so embarrassed by, sits on what used to be the Hartwell estate. The main house was torn down before you were born, but the property is still intact, still mine." She handed him another document, the trust fund paperwork, that showed a balance that made Michael's successful tech company look like pocket change. $8.7 million, he whispered, staring at the numbers like they might rearrange themselves. "This whole time you've been living like ... double quotes, like what, Michael? Like a normal person? Like someone who values relationships over status? Like someone who chose love over money?" Margaret sat down on the bed across from him, her voice gentle but firm. "Your biological father set up that trust fund when you were born. He wanted to make sure you'd be taken care of, even if he couldn't acknowledge you publicly. David made me promise never to touch it unless it was absolutely necessary, because he wanted to build our life together with his own hands." Michael's carefully constructed worldview was crumbling around him, and Margaret could see the panic in his eyes as he realized the implications of what he was learning. "Jessica," he said suddenly, his face going white. "Oh God, Jessica, she's been asking questions about you, about our family history. She said she wanted to do a genealogy project, but the Morrison family has been trying to find leverage against the Hartwells for decades," Margaret finished. "And you've been their unwitting source of information." Michael's head dropped into his hands, and for the first time since he'd walked into her house, he looked like the little boy she remembered, scared, confused, and desperately in need of his mother's comfort. "I've ruined everything," he whispered. "My marriage is a lie. My career is built on betrayal, and I just threw away the only real family I've ever had." Margaret moved to sit beside him on the bed, hesitating for just a moment before placing her hand on his shoulder. He didn't pull away. "Michael, look at me," she said softly. When he raised his head, she saw David's eyes looking back at her, not Jonathan's calculating gaze. But David's warmth and vulnerability. "You haven't ruined everything. You made mistakes, yes. You said cruel things, yes. But you're still my son. You're still David's son. And if you want to fix this, if you want to come home, there's still time." "But Jessica will have to make her own choices," Margaret interrupted. "Just like Jonathan had to make his. And I had to make mine, and David had to make his. The question is, what choice are you going to make?" Michael was quiet for a long time, staring at the documents spread across the bed, the proof of his true heritage. The evidence of the fortune he'd never known about, the testament to a love story that was far more complicated and beautiful than he'd ever imagined. "I don't know how to fix this," he said finally. "I don't know how to undo what I've done." Margaret smiled, the first genuine smile she'd felt since David's death. "You start by coming home, sweetheart. You start by remembering that family isn't about perfection, it's about forgiveness. And you start by understanding that the life you thought was so simple was actually built on the strongest foundation of all, unconditional love." She picked up the sealed letter that David had left for Michael, the one that was supposed to be opened only when their son needed to understand what it meant to be a man. "Your father left this for you," she said, holding it out to him. "Maybe it's time you read it." As Michael took the letter with shaking hands, Margaret felt something shift in the air between them. The first crack in the wall that had grown so high and thick over the past year, it wasn't forgiveness yet, and it wasn't healing, but it was a beginning. And sometimes Margaret thought as she watched her son's face in the soft light of the bedroom where she'd kept her secrets for so long. A beginning was all a family needed to find its way back to love, Outside, the sun was setting over the suburban street where Michael had learned to ride his bike, where David had taught him to throw a baseball, where Margaret had kissed, scraped knees and dried tears and told bedtime stories that always ended with the promise that love would win in the end. Maybe, just maybe, that promise still held true. The letter in Michael's hands contained David's final words to the son he'd chosen. 2 love words about sacrifice and courage, about the difference between being a father and being a dad, about the truth that had taken Margaret 35 years to share. And as Michael broke the seal and began to read, Margaret realized that sometimes the most powerful secrets aren't the ones we keep there, the ones we're finally brave enough to reveal. The spring air in Chicago carried the scent of cherry blossoms as Margaret stood in her backyard, watching Michael push his 3-year-old daughter, Emma, on the swing set that David had built years ago in hopeful anticipation of grandchildren. The little girl's laughter echoed across the 15 acres that Michael now understood represented not just property, but sacrifice, his mother's choice to live simply while sitting on a fortune, his father's determination to build something real with his own hands. Higher, Uncle Michael, higher, Emma squealed, her dark curls flying in the wind. She'd taken to calling him Uncle Michael after the divorce was finalized, when the custody arrangement meant she stayed with Margaret during Jessica's weekend visits. Michael had lost almost everything in the divorce. Jessica's father had moved quickly once the truth about the Hartwell connection came out, using Michael's unwitting betrayal of business secrets to destroy his reputation in Chicago's tech community. The California opportunity had evaporated overnight when Jessica's firm realized their conflict of interest, but watching his daughter's joy, Michael looked more at peace than Margaret had seen him in years. "Mom, did you ever regret it?" Michael asked as Emma jumped from the swing and ran toward the garden where Margaret was teaching her to plant tomatoes. "Giving up the Hartwell life for this?" Margaret smiled, dirt under her fingernails from the morning's gardening, wearing the same old clothes that Michael had once found embarrassing. "Look around you, sweetheart. Look at Emma's face. Listen to her laughter. This isn't what I gave up. This is what I chose." The community center had promoted her to director after she'd made a substantial anonymous donation to expand their youth programs. She'd finally started using small portions of the trust fund, but carefully. Purposefully funding scholarships for kids like Michael had been supporting families like theirs had been. Investing in the kind of quiet, lasting change that David would have approved of. Michael had moved back into his childhood bedroom, temporarily while he figured out his next steps. The tech company was gone, the marriage was over, and his social circle had evaporated once Jessica's true motives became public. But he was rebuilding, slowly and thoughtfully, with his mother's guidance and his daughter's unconditional love as his foundation. "I found something yesterday," Margaret said, pulling an envelope from her pocket. It was in one of Dad's toolboxes in the garage. He left it for Emma. Michael's eyes filled with tears as he recognized David's handwriting on the envelope. "For my granddaughter, when she's old enough to understand that the best inheritances aren't money, they're memories." Inside was a small wooden box that David had carved himself, filled with photos of him building the swing set, preparing the garden, fixing up the house, all the work he'd done with hope that someday a child would fill these spaces with joy. "He knew?" Michael asked, his voice thick with emotion. "He hoped," Margaret corrected. "He believed that love would find a way even when things looked impossible." Emma came running over, her small hands full of earthworms she'd discovered in the garden. "Grandma, look. I found treasure." Margaret laughed, the sound carrying across the yard like music. "The best kind of treasure, sweetheart. The kind that helps things grow." As the afternoon sun slanted through the old oak trees that had watched over this property for decades, Margaret felt David's presence in the gentle breeze, in Michael's newfound humility, in Emma's innocent joy. The safe in her closet still held millions of dollars and legal documents that could change their lives in an instant. But the real treasures were here in the backyard, 3 generations connected, not by blood or money, but by the conscious, daily choice to love, forgive, and build something beautiful together. Michael had learned that family wasn't about status or success, or meeting other people's expectations. It was about showing up day after day, even when it was hard. It was about choosing each other again and again, through disappointment and betrayal and loss. And Margaret had learned that sometimes the most radical act of love is refusing to change who you are for people who can't see your worth. David had seen it. Michael finally was beginning to see it. And Emma would grow up, knowing it as naturally as breathing. The modest house stood solid and welcoming as the sun set over suburban Chicago, its rooms filled once again with the sounds. A family not perfect, not without scars, but real and strong and built to last. Some secrets, Margaret realized, were worth keeping for 35 years, and some truths were worth waiting a lifetime to share. But the greatest truth of all was the simplest. Love doesn't count the cost, and family isn't about deserving, it's about belonging.